when does it start and when is it finished in writing?
Yeah, well,
Oh, sorry. Can you talk about the writing process in a nonfiction piece?
yeah, writing is just putting down on paper either, you know, the the thought or the deed. So I've always found it very difficult to know where writing stops and starts, and it's funny because it comes up with the Writers Guild over and over again. You know, well, who wrote this? You mean whose idea was it? Walper's. Well, I'm not going to give Walper the writing credit. Okay, well, all right. You know, the writer will get the story credit, and you know, well, but who figured out how to tell the story? Carnahan, the editor. You know, well, he's not a writer; he's an editor. He don't want a writing credit. So you know, already you've discarded the person whose idea it is, and the person who made the story work. So, you know, somebody comes along with words, and the two places where they have to be is in selling the thing. Almost invariably, somebody wants you to write it down. So there's that, which can be a page or a full-fledged treatment or even, you know, a hypothetical shooting script, and narration. And when you get to the point of writing the narration, the way we do it, you're almost done. You know exactly where the words are going to fall, pretty much, although you're always trying to write less. And if you've been working on the film straight along, you probably have a very good idea what those words are going to be, plus or minus. There's the plus or minus comes the art and the fun, you know, and the surprises. Sometimes the words give things new meaning. Sometimes the words can be magic, and but it is the whole process, and it's a small part of the process, and you can say both are equally true.
Well, who do you perceive your audience to be when you're creating these documentaries?
I don't know. Anyone, anyone at all, really. Yeah, I think that really television is about being universal, and there's absolutely no point in doing things that appeal to a small number or are understood by a small number of people, because you know there's so much easier ways to reach them. So you're talking about a huge number of people who may not know anything about your subject but are pretty bright, and that's who you're writing it for. And the wider the aperture, I think, of who you're writing for, the more people you're writing for, the greater variety, the better.
Now, and then in terms of compelling footage, what do you think makes a really good cameraman or makes for really compelling footage that will get people's attention?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, the visual storytelling these days is understood so well that almost any one of us could do it if we had a camera documentary, spontaneous camera work, for instance. I mean, it almost would come natural to any one of us had we the technical skill and the temperament and the patience and you know all that. Would What works dramatically is what has always worked. And it's always action. It's always cause and effect. It's always something that moves from here to there. Um, the the striking ability to go and get just the shot that's needed and discard all the rest, the so-called coverage, just seems to come naturally to some people and not to others. Um, what strikes me these days is how visually fluent everyone is, and how America's Funniest Home Videos. After all, somebody had to film that, and they knew what to film. And it's very interesting, and often more interesting than a lot of other things you're going to see on the air.
Storytelling.
Storytelling, the moment.
So, let's see. What makes a good narration and a good narrator? Or when do you think that you don't want a narrator?
Well, we always don't want narrators, and everybody's always struggling to make the narrationless film, and I'm always finding that at least a little bit of narration makes most films better. The good narrators, I think, are almost born not made. I mean, they have something beyond what the average good actor has. And many good actors can't really narrate very well. And I don't know whether the reverse is true or not. Some just, seem to have it. We did, John Lithgow narrates our Millennium Opus, a 2-hour NBC show we just finished, and I was not able to find anything he narrated. It's often very hard with actors if they haven't done anything much to find what they have done without asking them. If you don't know them personally, if you have to ask, it's already too late, So, but can't say we took a chance, but there was a little bit of doubt, And he walked into the studio, and after 5 minutes, I was a happy man. He just knew exactly how to say it, and brought all sorts of insight and meaning to the words and clarity. Wow, he understood. It's a great thing, and I think there are maybe 3 or 4 that I've worked with that I consider above and beyond normal. But many times, I don't know, there's such a thing as being too good. I'm thinking of, say, Peter Coyote. I probably wouldn't put in the first rank, but right in the second rank. And I think in terms of communicating with an American audience, the lack of art, evident art, was really an advantage with him. Stacy Keach would be in the same category. I mean, you're not always looking to hit it out of the park. Try that hard.
Can we talk about the editing process and what percentage of footage makes it to the screen, and how you find the rhythm of a show?
Well, glad you brought that up, because that brings up the editor, and I owe my life to editors, and clearly you've got to have the ingredients, and clearly you have to know how to put them together, and you can have them and not, and you might just as well not have tried. And I have seen good films made great from where I would have stopped, by a good editor. I've seen bad films made acceptable, and everything made more interesting by good editors, and that is the key craft. I think that you can't do anything without in documentary. I mean, you may not have shot it. You may make it out of pieces of TV you've recorded off broadcast. And you may not have a word of narration. You may not need one. You may never have committed the idea to paper. But somebody has to make that selection. Terribly, terribly important, and terribly underestimated, not sufficiently recognized.
What kind of equipment do you use in editing now?
No, Avid's. Avid.
More Avid. And how many people generally do you have working with you in the editing room?
Nowadays, 2. with exceptions. I think in the old days, an editor who worked without an assistant was almost impossible. 16 film, it was almost what was just so laborious and time-consuming to keep track of trims and outs and keep everything sorted. There are quite a good number of good editors who work on an Avid without aid. But I still think 2 is a good idea, if only because you need somebody to talk to.
How about the importance of music in the documentary, and how it's scored and how it can influence, emotions and understanding of the material?
You don't need it for every film, music. Sometimes it hurts more than it helps, I think. Our school, the West Coast School, has been relied heavily on music. And in my background, from Walper days, it was part of the package expected. And we were lucky, as I mentioned, to have access to really great composers early on. So I can't imagine making most films without it. It's very hard nowadays, I think, to get great emotional impact without being cliched. I mean, music itself is so readily available. It's so, everywhere. And it's so homogeneous that I think a really great score is a very difficult thing to achieve. Again, as with the editor, miracles can be accomplished, and happens all the time. I think if you have the luxury of having a composer and being able to bring the composer in on the creation of the film and establish some communication early on instead of just popping them in at the last moment, which is more often what we do, because their time is valuable and we don't want to waste it. But still, it's a wonderful thing.
What are the most important elements in creating a really solid documentary? I think you've touched on it. If there's anything more you want to...
Well, story. Seems to cover an awful lot of circumstances.
And and you talk about the importance of the structure. Where, in sifting through this material, you start, let me ask you another question. What are the tools of a modern-day documentarian with the current innovations and equipment that are essentials these days?
Well, I guess to our level of production, professional gear, which is easily rented, don't have to have it. I'd say nonlinear editing is almost universal. I'm beginning to think that online is beginning to become less necessary. I mean, some of the shops around here that are doing cable are doing everything under one roof, and the distinction between online and offline seems to be breaking down as you get better quality out of more easily available equipment. Is that the sort of thing you're thinking?
Yeah, I think, yeah. Now, but here's what I'm trying to get at with the structure. How do you know when the documentary is complete?
Yeah, well, when you run out of time to do it.
But there's a structural thing that you've got.
There is, yeah.
You're building.
Yeah.
And how do you know when you've got all your pieces in place?
Well, there is that moment when I think you've tried most of the wild ideas you might have about the possibilities of that given story. I mean, you probably know the most straight line way to put it together, and then you probably have some notions of more interesting ways, and you try them first. And if one of them doesn't really jump up and sing, you then get closer and closer to the pragmatic solution to all the problems. What bothers me is that boulder in the middle of the river, which somehow so hard to see until you get rid of it. There's always something in every story that you're in love with that prevents the rest of the story from working. And sometimes it's something you can't do without, so you have to find an equivalent or some way of working around it. But it seems like there's that obstruction, kind of great symbolic.
So even if you write it out and it all works, then when you go in there and you're completing it,
Usually,
another process,
yeah,
another
there's
aspect.
usually some ghost in the editing room. I'm not quite sure why. Well, I know. I mean, it's hard to visualize and understand how much of the story the picture's going to tell. And pictures, have a way of going off on their own. I mean, you go out to shoot an establishing shot of the city, and you happen to shoot it at a particular time, and it looks gorgeous. You meant it to look mean and nasty, nasty little place. And suddenly you've got a shot you can't use for your purpose. And maybe you don't need to establish the city, or maybe you need to go back and shoot it again, or maybe,
How would you say the state of documentaries has changed in television? And how do you see them in the future?
If I knew. Yeah, I mean, what's obvious to me is there's so much more of everything. And on the whole, I think it's better than the average of what used to be. It's hard to tell with the moving target. But as I say, I think the audience is fluent in the medium. They know what they're looking at. They get it right away. They give you a great deal more latitude to invent. I mean, for instance, recreation, which is a dirty word a few years ago, now it's almost taken as a matter of course. I mean, in the kinds of things we do, and films commonly weave in and out of recreated elements, and the audience seems to know, or at least not be bothered. I don't know whether, when you get right down to it, it's simply that nobody knows what's real anymore, or people are simply give greater latitude to the storyteller,
Well, how do you feel about the use of recreations?
I think it's academic, We're going to do it. So, it's not pro or con.
Uh-huh.
I think, the big principle is disclosure. I mean, being willing to say so, that, yeah, that was real and that was not. The whole thing has gotten so tricky these days. I mean, there really is a great book to be written by somebody, not me. No, by somebody about art and illusion, and as particularly as it applies to television. Because, was it real? And what do you really mean by real? Something that happens by accident, or something that happens by design because somebody means it to happen? When the scientist gets out of his car and walks into the office building, is it any less real because you told him to do it? Or is that fakery? Should you wait around for him to arrive? And what happens when he looks up and says, "Christ, who are you?" Well, so it's endless. But that's a way it's changed a lot. The audience accepts a great deal more, gives you a lot more boundary, but also expects a great deal more and is a lot more demanding. I mean, they don't want to hear about it; they want to see it, and that's driving everybody.
Driving them to...
Well, it's driving all of us and make things. we have to live up to their expectations, and we better not disappoint.
How do you think cable has offered wider distribution for documentaries? And how has this affected the network's interest in buying documentaries?
I think that the specification for a network documentary is probably just about the same. I mean, if you just think of a network as the most powerful cable station, I mean, the distinctions are technical. But what we'll get on the network is the really compelling thing, and that tends to be just a little bit of subject matter at any given time. All the rest of the stuff wouldn't have been on the network anyway. The general run of cable programming, not because it's bad, but because it's of limited interest. I mean, I've come away from this 5 years on NBC thinking that geographic specials don't belong in prime time on NBC.
Really?
Yeah. It's just too narrow an aperture. They're going after too big an audience to make it really practical to make geographic type documentaries in the real world on a regular schedule that will do what they need doing. It could change, but our ratings history is by no means glorious. We've had our time, but we'd be still there if we were putting Cyclones type numbers up, and we simply aren't. That's true. We're on Saturday nights because they gave up on us somewhere along the line and just decided to get these shows on the air out of the way. But which came first, the chicken or the egg? I don't know. But I do think it's doing it the hard way. And when you realize that the number of commercial breaks and the program time, which is now down around 44 minutes, and with a show like ours where, unlike the average drama or situation comedy where the characters are in place, the situation is known, you simply pick up, and it's like walking into a friend's living room. Our shows, for just to understand, need to be built upon a tower of facts, and those facts, the tower, when it's knocked down every 10 minutes, doesn't add up. So the story doesn't gather momentum. The whole thing kind of has to be regathered and reassembled every few minutes. It's crazy.
It's like a structural problem.
Yeah.
That you have to cope with in a way that's commercially, like you're saying, broken down.
Yeah. Now, granted, they're episodic documentaries. I suppose that's why Unsolved Mysteries and some of those things have worked so well. So they break down into small stories where, it's friendly to the medium. And somebody, sure as hell, will come along with some hit show like That's Incredible or something next year and prove us wrong. But for a long-form documentary, I think, thank God there's public television and cable. They don't seem to interrupt as often. And if they do, they don't interrupt quite as compellingly as the networks. One problem is the commercials are so good that they literally are tough competition. I mean, this leads to a little blabber about the nature of television and so forth, because I've been thinking a lot about it lately. I'm not quite sure why, except that things have changed so much. But one thing, people of my generation, a lot of them tend to be disillusioned and bitter about television, and I think today's generation doesn't understand why. But, when we were talking this morning about, you remember the first television picture you saw and when? We do. And, whereas with my kids, I used to tell them stories about BTV, before television, which to them might as well have been the Middle Ages. It fascinated them from the time, they could understand what I was saying. Tell us about before television. So something's happened in our lifetime that had enormous significance to people of my generation. It was such a miracle. It was just such a technical wonder. And it came along at such a perilous time, right after the war, when we were all desperately concerned with peace and stability and civilization. And it seemed like an Excalibur sword was put in our hands to make everything better. And it was so much more powerful even than radio, and it required so much less erudition to be able to, it was right to the common man. So we really expected to do miracles with it. And the networks, with their news departments, which we really held in awe, and we expected to live up to a certain standard of citizenship and responsibility, and they did quite often. Part of the body politic and part of the right to, make documentaries, say 20th Centuries or Project 20 shows, and put them on the air, put a tremendous burden on you. Responsibility. And it's that whole thing has just gone away in time, and a lot of us, I think, just were rather disappointed the way the whole story turned out. Now, granted, we're not looking on the other side, which I think is equally important, because while television was disappointing us all, it was also doing great things. I think kids are immensely more civilized because of television. I think they understand far more about the world. I think they express themselves much better. I think they're not literate, perhaps, but they're vocal. They communicate better. They have a lot more ideas. They have great ideas about possibilities of life. They see things every day, that before TV
Right.
were unimaginable, and you just glimpsed in the movies. So it's been a funny ride.